Yes.
I can, yes. Hello.
Great. All right. We are beginning the presentation, the East-West presentation here on the Mexican. We're having a little bit of difficulties with the software, but it's coming up. The presentation here is going to be looking at the Mexican operation in China, what's going on in Mexico, and what's occurring on the ground in Mexico. The scenario in Mexico we've got is a situation. We'll cover a couple points here. While the software is coming up, a couple housekeeping things. We've got to first. We're going to be welcoming questions while we're going through this process. If you've got questions, please type those questions in to the document. We can answer the questions for you. We will be forwarding a presentation after this, which will be a hyperlink to our presentation, so that you all will be able to see it and you'll be able to come on and look at the overall presentation after this webinar is completed. We will have a scenario where you will be able to ask any questions you want on this document. If you'll just type that into us, we're going to cover specifically 1 hour today. If it goes any further, we'll get back to you with answered questions. We do have a request for everyone here that if you have specific questions, you can email them to us. We'll get back to you in the next few days to respond back. The amount of time will take will be exactly an hour. The way we're going to break down this presentation is we're going to be looking at individuals, really looking at 5 specific industry sectors: automotive. We're going to be looking at appliances. We're going to be looking at electronics, and we're going to be looking at plastics, and we're going to look at process equipment. And in this presentation, we'll cover those 5 topics. We're then going to look at specific case studies to move forward. And you will have, in the specific case studies, we'll be doing 5 case studies to move forward on each one of these. So here's what we've got today. We're first going to talk about Mexico as a part of your global supply chain, then the 5 industry sectors, the advantages and disadvantages of the Mexican suppliers, and then the case study. Mark and Dan, your screen should now show the correct slide.
Yes.
Yeah, slide 2. Yes.
Okay. All right. So Mark, I'll turn over to you if you will now take it forward on part 2. Should Mexico be part of it? I'm going to briefly, before you do, I'm going to briefly introduce East-West. Move forward through this very quickly. Those of us who on the phone know us, we do a lot of corporate strategy, commercial, operational, risk management. We have executives from all over the world working for a variety of companies on the ground. The services we focus on are primarily in these core 9 services, and we operate in the U.S. and in these 4 primary emerging markets: Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, China, and Southeast Asia. And we specifically operate across multiple industry sectors, including automotive, metal fabrications, and the one you see here. So at this point, I'm now going to turn over to Mark Plum, and let Mark, if you will go ahead and take it, about should Mexico be part of your global supply chain.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Yeah. Good morning or good afternoon. So let's can you just go back 1 slide out real quick, please?
Sure.
So should Mexico be part of your global supply chain strategy? So we're going to focus really on 5 industries, as Alex mentioned: automotive, appliance, electronics, process equipment, and plastics. Then we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these 5 sectors from sourcing and or manufacturing in Mexico. And then we're going to have some case studies that will take us through those. Next slide, please. So should Mexico be part of your supply chain strategy? We won't belabor this too much. It's China's changed. We all know that for the last 20-25 years. Now we get the duty situation. We've got freight costs. We've got delays. We've got rising labor costs. We've got China 2025 transparency issues. So a lot of things have changed when you first went to China 20, 25, 30 years ago. We're going to break it into 2 groups. There's the companies that are in sourcing from the USA or North America, but a lot of the USA, sourcing components from China and it's worked pretty well. But now the costs have gone up. So, should you be looking at other sources of supply to bring those in, i.e. Mexico? And the second group of people is Mexico's growing so much and the consumption is growing so much and the OEMs are growing so fast down there. Do you need to have a manufacturing or a sourcing component facility nearby to supply the growing domestic and the growing OEMs that are developing in Mexico? So one, you're either bringing stuff in from China all the way here, and you got rising labor costs and long lead times, or two, you want to be down in Mexico to supply those guys down there, or you could be doing both. So anyway, that's kind of the two groups. Next slide, please, Alex. Just some quick things here, and again, I won't take you through a history lesson, but labor costs are 20% lower now in Mexico, and 20 years ago, China was 40% lower. Industrial lease space, and that's also lower in Mexico now in the Monterrey area versus the manufacturing areas of China. Transportation costs, well, we certainly know that it's 70% less to go from Monterrey, Mexico to Chicago than from Guangdong province to Chicago. Lower electric costs, pretty close, and then natural gas is also lower. So a lot of inherent infrastructure things that are moving some ideas towards Mexico. Next slide, please, Alex. Okay, so yeah, thanks. So first, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on five sectors, and we're going to move to a case study on automotive. Alex, would you next slide, please? Okay, yeah, let's talk a little bit about automotive. A lot of people in the States bring a ton of components in from China to feed the automotive industry here in the States and or Mexico. So you can see what's happened now with the domestic. When I say the domestic market, the production of automobiles in Mexico is now 1.3 million vehicles. Actually more, that was in 2019. 42 brands, 500 models, 1,100 tier one manufacturing companies. Probably 2 billion of the US FDI is committed to the auto industry. Basically all your major brands are down there. $93 billion worth of car parts were imported into the USA. About a third of what comes in from Mexico total, a third is in the auto industry. Big piece of car engines, seats, chassis. Another thing that's a tremendous amount of products such as electronics, connectors, fractional horsepower motors, aftermarket accessories. A tremendous amount of that, in terms of billions of dollars, is coming directly from China into the USA and into Mexico. So that stuff sometimes is quote unquote has kind of China written all over it. It's small, a lot of it's labor intensive, it ships easy, and big numbers of those coming in. Next slide, please, Alex. So let's take a look at the auto, and probably not a surprise to a lot of people, but it's clustered. As you can see, there's 400 part producing plants. You can see somewhere along the border, the USA border, some like the Maguila concept. They can bring stuff in, bring it out, in bond, out of bond. There's 2,000 companies make up 65% of the foreign-owned companies. So, I mean, as I said, every brand's there. So, and typically a lot of the suppliers, the brands take the suppliers with them. The Japanese take sometimes the Japanese guys, American, German, etc. 60% of the auto of the 5 billion went to the USA. Lastly, kind of what's changed recently, we all know, is the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada, a free trade agreement. Hundreds of pages. What in the auto industry, a big thing has changed is now local content. 75% of the automobile that's sold within those three countries has to be made or sourced in those three countries. So what does that say? It says maybe your Chinese operation isn't going to be as effective because they may want to buy, your customer may want to buy locally or in Mexico because he's got to reach the content rules. It's also one of the reasons we're finding Chinese companies moving to Mexico to get behind the barriers, to get behind and get within legalization of or acceptance of the USMCA content rules. So that's really a quick peek at autos, but a huge industry. Next slide, please, Alex. We'll go to appliances and take a quick run through that. So we're going to focus really on small appliances. The industry started out around major appliances, pretty much, you know, the Mobis, the GEs, the Whirlpools, the Bosch, Siemens, and now then it's evolved now into a lot of the small kitchen appliances, household appliances. You can see there's 9 billion annually, but take a look from China coming to the States or North America to the States is 45 billion. So you can see that China really dominates in this, and so if you're in the sourcing business and you're looking to buy finished goods of this sort out of China, okay, good. Your costs may have gone up a little bit, but you might want to take a look at Mexico now because they're growing rapidly, and they're growing rapidly because they want to because the economy there is growing, and they're becoming more competitive against the imported Chinese products. Again, that's why some of the Chinese guys are even moving down there, i.e. you see Hisense at the bottom. Number 2 and number 3 appliance manufacturer in China and up north has put a $250 million facility in Mexico. So big industry, growing rapidly, dominated by the Chinese for a lot of logistics reasons, and those logistics reasons and cost reasons may be changing some. Next slide, please, Alex. Again, like autos, clustered. You can see it. You can see the brands: Electrolux, Mabe, General Electric, Philips, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, you have Sunbeam. You have the Japanese. So there's a lot of clusters. The Monterrey area is really strong, as a lot of you know, because of the auto industry, the appliance industry. Now what's happened though is it's got 20% of the workforce. But west of Monterrey, actually east of Monterrey, Saltillo, is also growing a lot. Tier 1, Tier 2, 3 appliance guys have moved there. Labor costs are 50 and 20% cheaper than Monterrey. However, you still have great access to the USA because remember now, a lot of this product, a lot of it is going back to the States to replicate the 45 billion of what's coming in from China. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan, who's going to talk about the other 3 sectors.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Let's talk a little bit about the electronics sector, which is certainly a very significant industry. In terms of exports to the U.S., it ranks right behind the automotive sector, about 80 billion total, but 80% of that's going to the U.S. The major markets, electronics, very diverse market, obviously, but consumer products is a large fraction of that at 30%. And so, whether you're talking about televisions, monitors, audio-visual equipment, a big sector, primarily, much of that primarily located on the border regions for manufacturing. Automotive, we talked about the size of the automotive industry, and as automobiles become more sophisticated, greater growth in supply of electrical and electronic components into that sector. Telecommunications, certainly. Appliances, as we mentioned, growth in the appliance sector, driven by not the growth of the number of appliances, but the connectivity required and the future movement towards the Internet of Things and sophistication of controls around it. Medical, the medical equipment supply and instrumentation sector growing rapidly, primarily in the northwest corner of the country, and there's a strong electrical supply component of that. And then one thing that people don't think about very often is around power and switchgear. Transformers, switchgear, uninterruptible power supplies, both growing in a well-established manufacturing base in the country. Next slide, please, Alex. As I mentioned, it's a diverse manufacturing base located primarily throughout the northern, from the center of the northern half of the country. But in general, from a cluster standpoint, and again, it's very diverse, but if you're looking at audio and video and automotive, a lot in the Northeast, medical and consumer products towards the Northwest, appliances and consumer electronics, more the central part of the country, and then an increasing EMS, electronic manufacturing services sector located around Guadalajara. That's been in place for several years, but it has grown tremendously in the last couple of years with an influx of Taiwanese investment going into that region. Again, another group of companies looking to diversify away from their traditional manufacturing base in China. Many of those are larger companies. The smaller, medium-sized enterprises that are scattered throughout the country to support industry. You look at some areas where they are particularly specialized around wire harnesses, both for automotive, but also industrial equipment, sensing equipment particularly, is growing, and a number of smaller companies that are supplying that sector. PCB manufacturing is widespread, particularly around the border regions, the manufacturing sector around the borders, and you'll find a number of companies that can provide both long-run services, which would supply in the more industrial sector, but also you see more and more boutique shops or short-run prototyping services available. Electrical and electronic equipment assembly services are certainly big and have been for a long time. And what we've seen more in several last 5 years or so is an increase in repair services, where doing warranty work or repair south of the U.S. border, many of those operations have relocated from the U.S. Into Mexico in the last 5 to 10 years. Next slide, please, Alex. Talk about next sector, process equipment, which is not a large or particularly well-known sector, but it's something that's on our radar. It's really around the manufacturing, design, manufacturing, and of machinery and equipment used in the process industries. And that could be in food processing, chemical, pharma, mining, conveying equipment, filtration equipment, separation equipment, pressure vessels, boilers, mixing equipment. These things that are used by the process industries, you're seeing increasing numbers of manufacturers designing, putting that equipment together in Mexico. Next slide, please, Alex. The advantages of this is, again, you've got a well-established foundries and metalworking sector, particularly in the Northeast around Monterrey and Saltillo, which is the historical headquarters for metalworking in the country. With good technical resources, engineers, trade schools, welders, skilled craftsmen that are needed to support the trade. IP protection is and continues to be a concern in China. Although improvements have been made, you're seeing increased protection throughout the Chinese economy. It is still a long ways away from where it needs to be, and companies are particularly concerned about, particularly in this industry that has a lot of knowledge and know-how. It's not just design, but know-how on fabrication techniques. I want to keep that a little closer to home and a little better protected. And then again, familiarity and consistency with U.S. specifications. Some of us have had difficulties in the past when we're looking at equipment manufacturing overseas, and particularly in China, where that has its own set of GB codes and regulations around material specifications, design specifications, and standards. You've got a good industry in Mexico that's familiar with the U.S. requirements. Disadvantages that we've seen: limited ability to work with exotic alloys. Hastelloy, Inconel, titanium, materials that are used in highly critical corrosion environments, chemical resistance, less availability of those alloys, and less availability of people and experience that's needed to fabricate, weld, and prepare that. And I mentioned supplier clusters around Monterrey and Saltillo, which is a historically strong in the metalworking sector. Next slide, please, Alex. Plastics. Talk a little bit about plastics, which is another big industry. It's a $20 billion industry with nearly 5,000 manufacturers around the country. And there's a split there, certainly between the consumer sector and the downstream consumers of injection molded, blow molded, and increasingly 3D manufactured, 3D printing manufactured products. The automotive, aerospace, electronics assembly, medical devices, increasingly again in the Northwest, and the packaging materials. The raw materials, the resins, they are available from domestic manufacturers, but are primarily imported. About 80% of the resin that's consumed in the country is imported from the US. It's not a tremendous logistical challenge in that much of that's coming from the Gulf Coast of the US. But what you're seeing, a great deal of, a great large part of that is made up of imports of not just commodity plastics, but specifically, especially compounded with colorants and processing aids and additives, which much of that work is done in the US and exported in the US. There are domestic sources that I mentioned. The major hub for that is in the Northeast coast along near Tampico, where you see both a mix of domestic suppliers for commodity resins, as well as the big international players like BASF and SABIC. Next slide, please, Alex. The states highlighted in green are the major industrial states of the country, and there are widespread availability of injection molding capability and plastics processing all through that area. And what's a little bit different is that this is a technology and an operation that some of the smaller contract manufacturers and shelter companies along the border regions have invested in. A little bit uncommon that many of those companies really look for investment in equipment and technology from their clients and customers to support that expansion. And this is an outlier there where they've invested in that capability. And there is one large cluster of equipment and technical resources in the center part of the country, in Querétaro. It's good location to the auto manufacturers, and then the EMS services just to the west of that. And it's not terribly far from Monterey and that industrial cluster to the northeast. Next slide, please, Alex.
Yeah, Dan, before you get going, we've had two questions that popped in. One question was, company asked that, for you and Mark, asked that is it true that a lot of the Chinese companies have partnered up and joint ventured with some of the Mexican manufacturers so that a U.S. company may think they're buying from a Mexican operation, but really they're buying from a Mexican operation that's strictly sourcing from a Chinese operation. It's really more pass through.
We have seen some of that. It's the movement of Chinese companies into Mexico is relatively recent, so it's not terribly well established, but we do see it, and it's increasing. You're starting to see more Chinese presence in the major industrial hubs, not just the electronic sector, but as Mark mentioned, also appliances. So it's across the board.
Yeah, I agree with that. Then the second question was more of a COVID business related question. They talked about, okay, the question was EWA is operating in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, right? Does EWA think that this kind of global evaluation of supply chain, global manufacturing footprint, will that continue as companies look to diversify beyond China, or will post-COVID, right, when the vaccines are more widespread, do we think business will return more to normal? And I guess what they mean by the normal is more people going back to sourcing and supplying and manufacturing in China.
I think the urges. Go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say there's this trend really started long before COVID, as we all know. With China 2025, labor rates, the tariffs, as you saw probably this morning in the Wall Street Journal, the new Secretary of Trade is going to continue to keep it. Said the tariffs that are in play, the quote unquote Trump tariffs. So no, I believe, and I think a lot of us believe, the internal structure of China has over the last 20, 25 years has changed dramatically. And it doesn't mean, and that's what this webinar is all about, that everyone's going to be bailing out of China. We're not saying that, because China, because of their infrastructure and things, do some things very, very well. However, the areas where people were chasing labor and chasing those kind of things, those are still going to be there post-COVID.
Yeah, and I would add, I think that a lot of companies are now, supply chains have gotten so complex previous to this, that COVID just highlighted a lot of those problems. I think that people are looking at, at least the companies we're working with are looking at a much more, that a lot of them are looking at a regional supply chain base that they haven't looked before. And a lot of them are now looking at Mexico to service the US and the Mexican market. And they're looking more to Europe and what we're doing in Eastern Europe to service that market, rather than being totally dependent on sourcing 80% of what they are out of China and shipping that into Mexico, the US, and Poland.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep moving. Part 4.
Yep. Next slide, please, Alex. Some of the advantages of sourcing from Mexican suppliers as compared to China, in summary. The skilled workforce, lower labor costs, as we've talked before, particularly when compared to the coastal regions of China. That equation is flipped. Relatively low technical and management costs for the workers, and as recent studies have shown, that's equal to China. And those costs are rising fast. The rate of inflation, wage inflation, is higher than China, so that'll continue. That gap will grow. We've talked about lead times and its impact on inventory, and the ability to predict that. Certainly, many companies, probably several of you on the phone today, on the call today, are experiencing delays. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks is not uncommon. So that's highlighted some of the issues around running a global supply chain. Resolution of quality problems, in addition, is more complicated when you're dealing with thousands of miles and 12 time zones. And I mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, protection of intellectual property. That is still driving a lot of decisions by companies to leave their most sensitive or latest iteration technology out of China and move it, keep it closer to home. Next slide, please, Alex. Some of the disadvantages of sourcing from Mexican suppliers. Cost of key commodities and raw materials continues to be lower, 10, 15, 20% lower in China. It could be a combination of subsidies, it could be scale, it could be competition. But when we see, whether it's plastics, resins, or metals, or electronic components, we see consistently lower costs across the board. Chinese manufacturers, because of the broad manufacturing ecosystem and the experience and the scale, you'll find many more of those suppliers willing to take on more of the sourcing and execution piece of a manufacturing project, whereas you end up sourcing from Mexico with suppliers tends to be more hands-on, where a client needs to be much more involved in the sourcing and management of the activity, at least initially. I mentioned scale of infrastructure and raw materials and components. And in just 20 years history of US companies operating in China that have established not just their supplier base, but the technical and quality assurance staff that's on their payrolls very often that can support that operation. So with that, next slide, please, Alex. We'll start on case studies. I'll turn it over to Mark for a first case study.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. So we're gonna have 4 case studies. I'll run through a couple of them, and Dan will run through 2 of them. One is about an operation where the person wanted to really move out of China as it pertained not just to sourcing components, but actually move their assembly manufacturing operation. Another one, this next one is really a supply chain, looking for qualified component suppliers in Mexico to replicate or replace, I should say, what they're doing in China. Again, this third one is similar, but has a kind of a little different twist to it. Identification of Mexican suppliers. And then the last one is really it's a corporate, really a business development. Is Mexico the right place? What's it going to be? How do we do it? How do we buy land? How do we do this? You know, really a turnkey. So very, very interesting case. Next slide, please, Alex. So just a couple little things. You know, there's processes you have to go through. We go through them. Anyone who's really successful in this, you know, looking for new supply chains or looking for new manufacturing has to kind of, you know, have a process. And we identify and qualify suppliers. You have to establish many times a sourcing office to be, or a third-party sourcing office to stay on top of your end-of-line audits and supplier quality. You really need to do a little background on who you're buying from. Are they good people? Are they in jail? Do they pay their bills? Do they look for red envelopes? Do they own the whole supply chain? And you can't find an independent person. Really have to do your background. Really have to. Then, if you're going to re-identify and qualify, if you're going to subcontract versus, you know, your manufacturing, not just necessarily source components and/or blenders. Basic stuff you should really work through the make versus buy, and we do that for in our process. And then you have to assess the supply chain and then really understand supplier performance, have a continuous improvement built in, and obviously continual cost and decreases built in. Next slide, please, Alex. Very similar on if you're not just looking to source an additional valve, but you really want to move your manufacturing footprint, your processes. You got to really look at your footprint assessment and strategy development, and you got to look at it globally and look where your markets are and where you're shipping to, and lead times and duties and tariff and non-tariff. Again, who's available if you decide you don't really necessarily want to do it yourself. Maybe you just want to lease a building and subcontract it out to a third party, or you just want to have to a third party, you need to do your homework. Do you want to just maybe outsource part of it and then have that brought back in the components? Site selection, certainly. You know, we've just gone through, you know, areas where Dan and I talked about where people manufacture certain kind of products or build certain kind of products. You want to really understand your site selection. So if you're supplying one of these guys, you're in the right locale. And then if you have to implement, you know, a manufacturing facility, if you have to close one, let's say China, then you have to understand how to close one, have to understand how to relocate it, build it, and then rationalize and consolidate from 3 to 2, 2 to 1, whatever your case may be. So these are all the processes and skill sets that are required. Next slide, please, Alex. So let's take a look at case one here, and it's very, very classic. A Michigan manufacturer of automotive components had been in there for 20 years. They pretty much had good quality. They liked who they were sourcing some of their stuff from. However, you know, they're beginning to get a little edgy as to what was happening with labor cost and compliance issues, tariffs, logistics. Just a side note, now we all look at container costs now from China that used to be $2,000 to $3,000 or $6,000 to $7,000. So those things have really impacted. They said, well, let's take a look. We want to get closer to some of our Mexico-based customers, and we want to really decrease our dependence on China. Not necessarily leave, but certainly decrease dependence. And we were engaged to really do an expansion strategy or a recommendation for them for their boards, and then potentially to implement our recommended strategy. Again, quick back. We have a 5-step process on. You know, we assess the client, we assess where they want to go. We have an expansion strategy. We have on-the-ground negotiations. We have, and implementing is our 5 steps. So first step was to really understand what our client was doing. Well, he was leasing a building. The lease was up pretty soon. As costs were increasing, and as shipping and lead times were increasing dramatically as times and costs. So So that was a situation. We had to understand his products and the manufacturing processes. We then went to Mexico, and is there space there to either build a factory or lease a facility? The answer was yes. We found that. Could we put a factory up, or lease a factory, and be competitive with China? The answer was yes. We understood the permitting and government regulations pretty well because we've done that quite a bit. So we understood that process. We then take a look at number of suppliers and confirm that they're available and they have capacity. Now that's really interesting. People sometimes forget that, but if you have to always check their capacity, and then of course you have to do all your quality concerns, but the capacity is a big deal. And then the idea was, then if we could do that, we can move some of those components to Mexico. We would eliminate the duties from China to USA, and we'd also speed up our shipment time and costs. Next slide, please, Alex. So based on what we learned in 1 and 2 about assessing both Mexico and assessing our client, we were able to find out some assembly operations were again in line with what they thought they could do, and in line with what they were doing in China. They didn't really want to go jump in with a full manufacturing facility, so we went and recommended available sites for lease operations and warehousing. And then, as you guys know, around the world there's large developers who can really build a suit for you. They own it, they run it, but either they can have an existing building, which you can sometimes get very good deals on, or have them build a building to your specification and then lease it back to 5, 7, 10 years. And that's done a lot. Suppliers were available at similar pricing as they were buying in China. And by doing this, it would move them closer to their end customers, which were mostly the U.S. So we developed a business plan of leasing a facility, gave some ideas on the cost to lease, the cost to develop the facility, the cost for components, present that to the board. Board approved it. Next slide, please, Alex. So then we had to okay, now we have the green light. We had to begin to go which specific industrial park and which specific property and which specific developers, begin to negotiate that. Then get down to the exact piece of dirt, get down to leasing that exact piece of dirt, do the assessments and the audits of the potential shortlisted suppliers, bring the client down there to see the suppliers, and then finalize the meetings and begin to bring in their product development people. And then last was we put our project manager down there on the facility. He developed, and we all developed budget and time to set up the new operation. It was a leased operation, as I said. We work on the prototypes and qualifying with the selected suppliers, establish all the licenses and assembly operations, and working with the fire bureaus and all that sort of stuff. Began to help them move equipment from USA as well as China to the new facility. And that's tricky because if it's used equipment in certain SIC codes, they can come in duty free, others cannot, so you really have to work on that. Begin to assist with the startup and commissioning, and then early on help them with some of the early hires, like their general manager, their HR, their finance, the senior ones, who actually you get them hired 6 months or so before the project is finished, so they're up and running pretty fast. And then lastly, next slide, please, Alex. We were able to move most of all the stuff from all the products from China to Mexico. We identified multiple suppliers, and the cost savings really came through more on logistics and tariffs. In other words, we're not paying 25% tariffs now. We're not paying $9,000, $6,000 a container on the water. We're not tying that inventory up on the water for 6 to 9 weeks for $1.5 million. And as I said, we're able to reduce our lead times from 9 weeks to 3 weeks, which, as you guys know, you can then, if you have to lock your schedule for 14 weeks because that stuff goes on the water, you can't change it. and then your mix changes. That's difficult. Well, this way we're able to shorten the locking of our production, and then we were able to make changes up to 4 weeks, which is really helpful. So and then we helped them close up their operation in China. So very successful project. Dan, I think you're up on the next one, please.
Yes, second case study is related to relocating sourcing activities from China into Mexico, and this was a seller of high-end kitchenware, so utensils and cookware that had been sourcing for years in southern China. They had an extensive supply chain that they developed over the years, and they were about 80% reliant on imports. And they had set up an effective group of quality assurance people and sourcing specialists to make sure that continued smoothly. With tariffs and that added to a long escalation in costs as the economy developed in China and wage rates went up. So they made a decision to evaluating Mexico as an attempt to reduce cost and inventories, but also to spread the risk from having too many eggs in one basket. And East West was asked to help them evaluate the supply chain and determine how best to diversify that. Next slide, please. So as Mark mentioned, we have a 5-step process, and the first step was to assess the client's business to understand what the products were, what the key supplier capabilities need to be from a manufacturing standpoint, understand what the costs are and the cost breakdown, what the volumes were as far as current volumes, but also growth projections to make sure that whatever suppliers we ended up choosing were scalable to be able to handle increased growth as their business growth as their group. Looked at an assessment of Mexico as a fit, looked for suitable regions. So this was metalworking, metal bending, needed stamping, but being a high-end product, an upscale product, surface treatment was important. So they were looking at coating and enameling as key critical competencies. And they were concerned about security and ability to access the suppliers. They expected to have their quality people from the U.S. travel there regularly, wanted to have good airport access and secure connections. And then as the market was primarily in the U.S., they were looking for good, relatively close to the border and good logistics to the border. With that criteria, those major criteria, we selected Monterrey as a focus area. It's a historical center for metalworking and foundry services and machining, metal stamping in the area. When we looked at how to expand, decided to take a look at 20% of the China spend as a first step to diversify some of the geographic risk, but not to make it too large a project to make it unwieldy. And we focused on the higher volume products to try to reduce the complexity of this transition. And then we looked at supplier capabilities, the metalworking, but also the powder coating and enameling and plating capabilities. And then one area that was a little bit different here is that they were looking for warehousing and stocking support in Mexico, and that is not as common a feature in many contract manufacturers and suppliers in the country. Most of them are looking to make and ship as soon as possible. So we're looking for someone that would be able to support some warehousing in country. Developed a short list of suppliers and developed a request for proposal for products and services. Next slide, please, Alex.
Dan, before we go to the next slide, we had another question pop up, what they were talking about. There you've got supplier capabilities, stamping, aluminum, casting, powder. And the question was, how did you find the technical capabilities of the Mexicans versus the Chinese for stamping and aluminum casting?
Stamping was no problem. We were a little bit more challenged with aluminum casting. That's a harder fit. We did find some folks, and we were able to do that, but that's less common in Mexico, and that was a little harder to find for us. Yeah. We were able to accommodate. So we evaluated the proposals, looked at both pricing and quality primarily, as well as a number of requirements there. And then once we shortlisted, we East West did an audit of the supplier facilities. People with a manufacturing background primarily went in to look at, how the shop was run, the production processes, the quality management systems. And in this case, there was a bit of an emphasis on environmental compliance. So when you're dealing with paints and coatings and plating operations, there's more environmental risk for those sorts of operations. So we want to make sure that we were on sound footing there, and selected 3 suppliers. Next slide, please, Alex. So finally, the implementation, we arranged for client visits. We assisted with contract negotiations that focused on both the initial cost, but also the look for cost saving sharings formulas where we could look at, as volumes improved, productivity improved, how could we share the benefits from there? And then set up a project team between the client, ourselves initially, and the suppliers to manage that transition. It would be the basis for an ongoing supplier quality team going forward. Next slide. And it turned out to be successful. It took us about 3 months to do the transition. Achieved the expected reductions in lead times. About 6 weeks in transit time was reduced. Reduced costs moderately on a unit cost basis by $400,000. Inventories reduced significantly, over $1 million, and then it reduced the tariff impact, and that was close to $1 million improvement also. So a pretty successful project for us. So Mark?
Sure, thanks, Dan. Yeah, this one is, again, an interesting one, as I said, with a little different spin to it. So Heil-based producer of valves, accessories, fittings, couplings, pretty basic stuff, but with some technology. They had a good supply chain in China. 80% of what they produced was in China. Had some pretty good engineers and quality people there. Had been in there close to 20 years. And the products were shipped to USA for warehousing and final shipment to customers. The costs, like everybody, I should say, well, most people, had gone up several fold in the last 3 to 5 years. Again, starting with the labor rates, and then transitioning to some of the buy China stuff, and then transitioning to tariffs, and then freight costs, et cetera, et cetera. The board said, hey, you need to start looking at maybe sourcing stainless steel castings outside. You maybe we should take a look at Mexico. East West was hired to brought in. We do our, as I said, we've both said, Dan and I know, our 5-step process. Really interview and get an idea on the product and the specs and the landed costs, and how their team goes about this. What's their volume and growth plans, as we talked about. We identified in Mexico potential guys that can make the stainless steel castings in Mexico, as vis-a-vis China. Reviewed the specs, the volumes, all good. Obtained pricing from the manufacturer, Ex Works, as well as landed, delivered to the USA, and then visited several stainless steel foundries and so forth. And next step was hit. This was an interesting one. We could not identify we could find qualified suppliers. That was good. They met the quality standards, but we couldn't hit the price points. And then as we dig into it, it's just there's not a lot of labor involved in this product. It's really driven by raw materials, frankly, and some investment in technology. And our pricing was 30% higher. If you look at raw material steel and raw stainless steel, even today as we speak, they're 20% cheaper in China. So this product was really driven by the commodity costs, and that more than offset what they could find in Mexico. So they decided we stopped the project because we recommended that they stay in China with these stainless steel castings. So wasn't what way we thought it would turn out, but with the high content of components and very little labor, that one drove drove China. And as we said early on, in one of the early slides, replicating China's infrastructure in 25, 30, 35 years is very difficult. So you have to find the spots where you can win and the spots where maybe you can't win. And this was one we recommended. You really can't win on this one. You should stay where you're at. So it was quite interesting. Okay, last one, Dan. I think you've got the last.
Yep.
The last case. Yep.
Yeah. This was a case. It was really primarily around a manufacturing footprint, in addition to looking at a supplier base. Next slide, please. And this was a company that manufactured and distributed electronic products. And they had three small factories in the US and a large operation in China that had been in place for almost 20 years. Their customer base was primarily in North America. They had both US and Mexican customers. But their manufacturing in the US focused on the lower volume specialized products, and they used China for the higher volume. And in China operation also had some market share overseas, and they supplied about 20% of their output went in the Chinese market. So the framework with this was where we started with was to take a look at consolidation of the three US plants into one operation, establishing a Mexican assembly operation supply chain to relocate from China and close down the China operation. So it was really shift everything closer to home. Next slide, please, Alex.
Dan, a question popped up here, which was they're asking about human resources. You evaluate companies. They asked about how difficult it was for East West to find our team in Mexico, and how difficult is it as far as hiring people in Mexico? Is it more difficult than China, Southeast Asia, the US? Same process? Are there certain? The question was, can you get senior and mid-level executives in Mexico the same you can get in US or China?
Well, you can get senior folks, certainly. When you get in, particularly in manufacturing environment, when you're looking at senior plant managers, senior supply chain people, there's not a huge difference in cost that you pay for those folks. Really, the labor savings is on the shop floor. Okay. And as far as complications, it's definitely more complicated in Mexico than the U.S. Labor contracts and the labor regime is more complicated. And somewhat more complicated than China. So the HR function, you need to put a little more emphasis and effort in the HR function in Mexico than you would in some other parts of the world.
Yeah. In the case of our staff, I think we're fortunate. We work with people, and that's where it's so helpful that we've known 10, 15, 20 years in the countries where we're active. So our learning curve is really quite low based on the team that's been there for a long, long time.
Good point. Yeah. And they all meet the same qualifications of having run Mexico for West.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. No,
I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Okay. And so again, as we went through this, we started to look at started with understand the client's business, the product lines, the assets they had, what the finished products were, how they were produced, where they were sold. Understand the operating cost structure, their current logistics costs, and then of course they'd been hit by duties and tariffs as well in the last couple of years. Next slide, please, Alex. So we went in this looking at three different work streams, three different assessments. So we wanted to look at consolidating in the U.S. And we looked at what it would cost, what would be required to close down the operation in China, and then the costs and associated sequence of events to establish an assembly operation, sourcing operation, supply chain in Mexico. For the U.S., we developed a plan that included the tasks, timetables, and the costs. Again, it's around, do you need to hire more people? Factory requirements. Do you consolidate everything to one existing site? Do you need to go into a new site? Do you need to expand? What would be the startup cost, the equipment cost, cost to relocate equipment, and then future state operating costs, logistics costs, and then inventory impacts on inventories. Normally, as you would consolidate the number of sites, you'd expect the inventory requirements to go down, and so they free up some cash from that. Next slide, please, Alex. Then we looked at the China operation. Again, quite a few people, so we needed to understand the severance cost and retention incentives for employees. The severance cost can be high in China, particularly if you got a long tenured workforce, and that was the case here. We looked at the regulatory considerations, understanding government notifications, and particularly around the environmental regulatory regimes, which have become more stringent and more comprehensive in the last 5 years or so. We looked at the major equipment that they had in place, what would have to be written off, and what would the cost be, and then estimate the results of offsetting costs from property sales that would be used to offset the shutdown costs. Next slide, please, Alex. And then likewise in Mexico, look at costs associated with setting up the operation from a lease, from a people standpoint, what the structure would be. Would you go to a contract manufacturer? Would you do it yourself? Would you use a shelter services arrangement, which is sort of a hybrid? Understand the timetable and again, the cost to fit out. And again, we would expect some inventory savings improvement by moving closer to the year-end market, and so factor that into the comparison. Next slide, please, Alex. So on the U.S. side, yeah, it made sense. So based on the assessment, made sense to consolidate into one site, and it would result in savings. And so we came to an agreement on that, and East West developed a project plan to work on that implementation. The other piece of this, the China piece, that didn't work out so well. The decision was made not to close that factory. Part of it was the environmental costs, and so in dealing with the electronics industry, can be some problematical materials that you're handling, and they were just concerned about the history at the site and inability to predict what would be required from a remediation standpoint. There was also a significant amount of pushback from the commercial team. They didn't want to walk away. They felt like they would be walking away from a significant amount of sales in China if they shut down. And then the severance costs is a long tenured workforce, average age over 10 years. So that was significant. So without a shutdown in China, then the need for and feasibility of setting up a large operation in Mexico went away. So we decided not to move forward establishing a significant footprint there, but looked at limited contract manufacturing for some senior specialty products. Step 4, consolidate the sites, provide a project manager to do that, and to close closure plans for 3 sites. And then in Mexico, we looked at contract manufacturing for, again, a few select specialty products. Went through a similar process we've described before, where we've issued an RFP and worked with the bidders to qualify them and came up with 3 that we could recommend. Next slide, Alex. Hands-on implementation went well. We provide a project manager to oversee the equipment movement and assist with the hiring and staffing. And in Mexico, again, arranged for client visits to suppliers and assisted with contract negotiations, and set up a project team to manage that transition between the client and the new suppliers. Next slide. So in the US, 5-month transition after startup was successful. Operating cost savings around $600,000, reduced inventories by about 20%, and simplified the whole order fulfillment process by coming from a single site. And then qualified electronic supplier in Mexico on a 4-month window, had that completed within 4 months, reduced, as would expect, to reduce the lead times and improve the demand change and reduce the tariff impact significantly for those particular products, so it'd be on a much smaller scale than we envisioned going in.
All right, well, that ends the webinar on Mexico. Thank you all very much for taking the time to attend. If you have any questions, please let us know. There are several questions we could not get to just time-wise, We were trying to put in a lot of information in here, so we will be following up with those people directly. Thank you again for participating, and if you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you. Bye-bye.